Hello and welcome, dear viewers. In the previous video, we successfully assembled a 1/72 scale model of the Soviet self-propelled artillery unit 81 from Unimodels. Today we're going to create a diorama that goes along with this model. While it's tempting to jump into the exciting detail right away, it's important to remember that creating a good diorama requires careful planning. And planning always begins with an idea. My concept for this diorama has been in my mind for quite some time, and now the task ahead is to adapt it to fit dimension of the vehicle model and figures. So all our work will be done in the 1/72 scale. Additionally, we'll be adding a few details that will give the diorama a special charm and atmosphere. The main additional feature of my diorama should be an old house. However, before I started creating a model of this house, I needed to make a foam board prototype. This prototype turned out a bit rough, but it was essential to capture the correct dimension of the building. Then, to create the actual model, I began thinking about how to use the foam board shape and bamboo stick. Bamboo sticks have a shape of a log and they are perfect for representing a log cabin, which you could find in one of the many villages of the Soviet Union. But then another idea struck me. Why not to use real technology to create this house? Well, okay, maybe not 100% authentic, but at least something close to reality. What could possibly go wrong, right? Inspired by my idea, I took a hobby knife and a ruler and started cutting the logs to the desired size. The work was progressing well and diligently, until I realized that these logs were more suitable for 1/35 scale, but not for 1/72, and they would look quite strange on my diorama. Of course, I wasn't pleased with the time spent, but I thanked my lucky stars that I had a smaller stick on hand. I prized myself for buying several kilograms of wire sticks at the local kebab shop 2 years ago. So, using the correctly sized sticks, I managed to create a wonderful replica of a log cabin wall. After this realization, I understood that it could be better to cut out window and door before I glued all the stick together. Another lesson that I should invest in a tool to speed up the cutting process. But let's leave all this issue for the future. At the moment, I was busy reassembling the house. It turned out a bit crooked, but that was actually good, because on the diorama it would look like an old house, which was my goal. After all necessary parts were glued together, I decided to work on the doorway, create a door model and try on the resulting detail on the diorama. Naturally, I conducted this fitting together with the tank and one of the figurines. It turned out quite well, but as for the window, I should probably forget about it since it would hardly be visible and wouldn't add much to the atmosphere. It would simply look like a window on the top of the wall without any special significance. After completing the previous work, I faced a new challenge. I found it really hard to decide how to properly position the roof on this house. I wanted it to not look too bulky and not occupy half of the diorama. I immediately ruled out several standard roof options, such as thatched roof or metal sheet. Firstly, I wasn't particularly fond of a thatched roof, and a metal sheet roof was a relatively rare sight and was more common in wealthier village. I was fortunate to came across a photo from the internet, dated 1935. Which showed a roof made of several layers of roofing felt. I really liked this idea. To simulate the roofing felt, I used thick paper, and to create the planks that held this roof, I used 0.4 mm wood veneer. You might think the whole roof is excessively covered in glue. I want to reassure you that all the excess will be removed just before painting, and what I left behind created an interesting texture, enhancing the diorama. Now that the main feature was ready, I started thinking about the small detail. Since our diorama depicts a village, I decided to begin by adding a pile of firewood. To create this detail, I took bamboo stick. Lord, how I love this material. When I had cut the bamboo stick to the appropriate size to make them look like a pile of firewood in 1/72 scale. Then I started gluing them together. I managed to achieve the desired scale, and the pile of firewood looked good. However, one pile of firewood wasn't enough. I began searching for inspiration and ideas by looking at historical photos. One of these ideas was to add a simple ladder on the side of the house. This detail, though straightforward, fit perfectly into the village atmosphere. To create the ladder, I took a household broom. Turned out to be an excellent material for a ladder in 1/72 scale. However, the ladder and the pile of firewood would look lonely on the diorama. So the next detail I added was a rustic bench. Creating it I didn't take much time. I simply processed the veneer, cut 2 pieces of bamboo stick, and voila! A perfect and simple rural bench was ready. I decided to place it along the long wall to fill the empty space. Now that the main and small details of the diorama was ready, it was time to create the terrain relief and simulate the ground surface. But first I need to trim the foam board to make room for the road and give the diorama a more interesting and varied relief. Afterward, I began working on the relief, applying a layer of PVA glue to the foam and adding air-drying clay. This time I preferred to use clay instead of the standard mix of plaster, sand and PVA glue. I found working with clay more enjoyable. It was more convenient and allowed me to create different texture and track left by vehicle and tanks. However, while creating the relief, I noticed that the house was positioned below ground level, which seemed illogical and unnatural. To address this, I decided to dig a ditch alongside the house to allow water to flow. This became an additional interesting element of the diorama, and I planned to create a bridge over this ditch later. Once I finished working on the relief and was satisfied with the result, I moved on to the final step using 0.4 mm wood veneer to give the diorama a more professional appearance. Later, during the final painting, the side of the diorama will be painted black to give it a finished look. However, the next day I encountered a significant disappointment. I have not seen water for 2000 years. When my friends say, the joke is funny but the situation is very sad. I had to find a way out of the problem. It was time to use my most loved mixture. I'm talking about mixture of plaster, sand and PVA glue. Because only this material could save the diorama, fill in the unwanted cracks and add additional relief. Perhaps the issue with the clay happened because of thick layer, but I am not too knowledgeable about this. So if any of you can explain why the clay cracked, I would be grateful to know. But let's get back to creating a new relief for our diorama. I needed to apply the texture paste quite thickly, since I planned to create a new road, pathways and of course install small details, securing them with superglue. It was also important to use real soil and small stones that I picked up on the road during a walk. This material complemented the diorama perfectly, and after painting, the stones would create an interesting effect. Next, I started creating the road that various vehicles would travel on. And of course, I didn't forget about the tank tracks. While working on the road, I had the idea to add something in the corner of the diorama to avoid emptiness. Such an unbalanced distribution can negatively affect the overall perception. The idea came to me to add a footpath that could lead to the river, where the locals fetch water for their needs. After the diorama had dried, the process of adding various grasses began. Since this diorama is set in winter, there wasn't a need for too much grass. However, a few tapped could and changed the overall impression of the diorama. I hardly documented the process of planting grass, as many know how to do it using a flock applicator or even just their hand. But I can't emphasize enough, a quality flock applicator can significantly improve your work. While I respect my homemade flock applicator, I sometimes dream of acquiring a real professional one to make my grass always look lush and realistic. But let's get back to work. After planting the fine grass, I started placing a few larger tufts. In 1/72 scale you can go too wild with vegetation on diorama, and many modelers keep it relatively simple. This does create an atmosphere, but sometimes it looks too primitive and unrealistic. For example, my work with the graves of German soldiers still haunts me in my nightmares. Well, it's time to let the diorama dry and shift my focus to work on the figures. This time I had to work with Orion company figures. Again, they represent decent model of Soviet tank crewmen, but I don't particularly like material they are made of. It doesn't cut well with a modeling knife, and I have to remove excess detail with using fire. I plan to use 3 figurines on the diorama. One of them needs some modification. Currently it's an image of a tank crewman, but after the modification he will become an old grandfather living in the house I created earlier. My idea is that the tank crewmen are turned into the grandfather for the direction and information on where to fetch water. I came up with this idea when I saw the pose of this model. Notice how these poles and raised hand point in a direction. In the original version this model depicts a sitting soldier, but after my modification and the addition of detail made from the green stuff, he kept into a very old man in a coat, fur hat and a long beard. And this a little tip. If you want to depict an old character, adding a long and grey beard always helps. This way you immediately make his age noticeable to the viewers of the diorama. To modify the figurine, I decided not spend too much time, as I believed that the result was sufficient for this diorama. Then I finally moved on to the most interesting part of any diorama. It's painting. For priming, I choose black as the color. First I started by priming the figurine models, and then I moved on to the priming the fully dried diorama. Before painting, I also attached masking tape to the edges of the diorama, to prevent excess paint from getting on them and spoiling my plants. I also added a small element, a staircase with handrails, at the very bottom edge of the diorama. I thought it fit nicely into the overall scene. After the priming had dried, it was time to paint the grass. For this I used several shades of green, primarily olive green, to emphasize that it's winter grass and should look slightly frosty. Everything was going as planned, until I accidentally spilled a huge blob of olive paint directly onto the diorama. It was my mistake, as I was roughing. Working on a diorama should not to be hurried. Never rush. Imagine that you meditating and call me doing your work ignoring time. Only that way can you achieve a good result. Back to painting the diorama. At this point I'm using a slightly lighter shade of olive and add a volume to the grass. After that I decided to work on painting the ground. I started with the dark brown color that is closer to grey. This color was used to even out transition and set the base color for the ground. Then I used a lighter grey color and created a several small paths of different sizes to diversify the ground texture. Only after this I use a mix of brown and ivory colors to apply light patches to the surface of the ground. Once I finished working on the grass and ground, I shifted my focus to the other object, intending to return to the painting the ground and look at it with fresh eye. I believe that such switching helps you notice new detail and come up with new idea while working on a diorama. Moving on to painting the smaller detail, I prepared a wet palette. This is an important technique for modelers that helps keep paint fresh and prevents them from drying out while working on a diorama or figurines. My task was to paint the wooden parts in the base color. because further work would involve washes and dry brushing technique. The base color was not only used for small wooden detail, but also for the planks attached to the roof on the house. Some attention was also given to the walls of the house. Instead of leaving them black, I decided to add some brown color, which would be helpful during weathering. The result pleasantly surprised me. The house looked really old, exactly what I want. Next I moved on to working with the oil paint, starting with the house roof. Adding green moss to the roof requires some time and attention. Previously I had only experience working with a dark color of oil paint, using them as washes for the models, so working with another oil paint was a new experience for me. To create the moss I used English green and light ochre. This combination of paint harmonized with the grey roof and wooden planks, giving the roof an antique appearance. I was very satisfied with the result and didn't even want to add snow to this roof. Moving on to the next stage, I began using shading washes based on oil paint. My preferred color for this work is Van Dyke Brown. The process is quite simple. You just apply well diluted oil paint all over the diorama, and after it dries, you will have fantastic artificial shadows through the diorama. After completing this stage, I felt the diorama to dry and moving on to paint the figures. However, I encountered some minor vision issues due to pressure, so I had to paint the models almost right in front of my face, make it difficult to capture the process on a video camera. I hope you will forgive me for this. I already ordered special glasses and hope that in the future we'll be able to provide you high quality figurine painting. So, here is what we achieved without using snow. Currently the tank and the figures in winter clothes look somewhat out of place on this diorama. However, even without snow, I was very satisfied with the work I will done. Overall, everything is ready for applying the snow. But let's go back to our vehicles and add the weathering that I promised in previous video. The simplest and most effective way to add dirt to the tank is to use acrylic paint mixed with chalk pigments. After drying, the substance looks like dried mud, indicating that its vehicle didn't just come from the factory, but has been navigating rough terrain for a while, overcoming various obstacles. This time I also tried adding mud splatters, and I think it turned out quite well. What do you think? Now, my friend, we are moving to the most challenging stage of building this diorama. A stage that can undo all our effort in mere seconds. It's time to add snow effect to the diorama. Since I didn't buy high quality snow simulation material, I will have to go with the simplest option, using baking soda mixed with white acrylic paint and PVA glue. Yes, this snow doesn't look entirely natural, and in some places it might even seem odd. However, it's perhaps the most affordable material for those who can't invest a lot in this hobby. Of course, many of you can say, snow simulation material doesn't require significant investment, and to some extent you'll be right. My issue is that I will already spend over $100 on this hobby this month, with my monthly income being $800, maybe $900. That's a serious dent in my wallet, especially considering the fact I can't stand spending money. And here is what we got, my friend. I think this diorama look very decent. Even with a sufficient number of details, a diorama that relatively simply painted can create a pleasing effect. This is exactly what I wanted from this diorama. I'm satisfied with the result and I hope you enjoy watching the process of creating this diorama. If you like my work, you can always give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment pointing out any mistakes or asking any question you may have. If you don't like my content, you always can place your dislike, maybe, I don't know. And you also can subscribe to my Patreon to help me purchase material and kit for creating a new diorama, sending virtual hugs to all of you, wishing you a pleasant day, a comfortable and safe environment. Goodbye for now.